In a forgotten corner of Pine Grove Care Center, an old Italian cobbler sits silently in his wheelchair, desperately tapping a worn leather shoe. No words can escape his paralyzed body, but his eyes scream what his mouth cannot. I have a secret worth millions, and my own children don't deserve a penny of it. When Nurse Abigail Winters discovers what's hidden in the sole of that shoe, she uncovers not just a fortune, but a web of betrayal spanning decades. As the abandoned father fights to communicate his final wishes, his greedy sons return with a vengeance, determined to claim what they believe is rightfully theirs. But the old cobbler has one last masterpiece to craft, a testament sewn with the same precision as the shoes that carried him to America so many years ago. Who will inherit the fortune hidden by a man who can no longer speak? Follow this heart-wrenching story of family betrayal, unexpected connection, and one father's determination to be heard when it matters most. If you've ever wondered what truly matters at the end of a life, this story will leave you in tears. Follow our channel, like this video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sound was what caught her attention first. A persistent tapping that echoed down the sterile hallway of Pine Grove Care Center. Tap, 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 rhythmic yet somehow desperate, like a fading heartbeat trying to signal for help. Nurse Abigail Winters paused at the nurse's station, her pen hovering over Mrs. Hernandez's medication chart. The night shift had been uneventful until now, 2:17 a.m. according to the wall clock with its soft blue glow. The hallway was quiet, except for that sound. Tap, tap, tap. "Can you hear that?" she asked Nancy, the other night nurse who was organizing tomorrow's medication trays. Nancy shrugged without looking up. "Probably just old Mr. Morrison knocking his cane against the bed rail again. He does that when his pain meds wear off." But Abigail knew better. Morrison was in 214 and this was coming from further down, room 217. Her intuition, honed by 15 years in elder care, told her this wasn't just random noise. There was intention behind it. Tap, tap, tap. She followed the sound down the dimly lit corridor, past rooms where elderly residents slept, some peacefully, others with the restlessness that often came with dementia or chronic pain. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional green that somehow made even healthy skin look sickly. The tapping grew louder as she approached room 217, Leo Giovanelli's room. The thought sent an uncomfortable chill across her shoulders. Leo hadn't made a deliberate sound in months, not since the massive stroke that had robbed him of his speech and most of his mobility. His medical chart described him as non-verbal, minimally responsive. Yet someone, something, was definitely making that noise. Abigail hesitated outside the door. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible between door and frame. She pushed it open gently with her fingertips. "Mr. Giovanelli, are you okay?" The tapping stopped instantly. The room was dark, except for the amber glow of the vitals monitor and the sliver of hallway light now stretching across the linoleum floor. She could make out the silhouette of the old man in his wheelchair by the window, exactly where the evening staff had left him. According to his chart, he sometimes slept better in his chair than in bed. His thin frame was motionless, except for a trembling right arm. Abigail flipped on the softest setting of the overhead lights. Leo Giovanelli sat with his head slightly bowed, his weathered face a map of 9 decades of life. His right hand was hovering over his lap, shaking with effort. And there, resting across his knees, was an old worn brown leather shoe, the source of the tapping. But what made Abigail's breath catch was his eyes. They were wide open, glistening with tears that tracked silently down his hollow cheeks. Those weren't the vacant eyes she'd seen during her daily care routine. They were alert, desperate, filled with a silent plea that struck her with an almost physical force. "What is it, Mr. Giovanelli? What's wrong?" she whispered, moving closer. Leo's eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone who had been classified as minimally responsive. His trembling hand struggled to tap against the leather shoe again. Tap, tap. Assuming it was an involuntary movement causing him distress, Abigail gently reached for the shoe to move it away. "Let me get this out of your way." The moment her fingers touched the leather, Leo made a sound she'd never heard from him before, a guttural, strangled grunt that seemed wrenched from deep in his chest. His tears flowed more freely now, and his eyes widened with what could only be described as panic. Abigail froze, her hand still on the shoe. You want this here? Leo's eyes blinked once, deliberately, the closest thing to communication he'd shown in months. She slowly withdrew her hand, studying the old man with new eyes. Leo had been at Pine Grove for nearly 5 months, ever since his stroke had left him unable to care for himself. She'd read his intake forms when he first arrived. 91 years old, Italian immigrant, widower, former cobbler with his own small shop in the Italian district until he retired in his 70s. She'd also noticed something else in those 5 months. No visitors, not once. His contact information listed 2 sons, Dylan and Charles, but neither had ever come to see their father after signing the admission paperwork. They paid his bills via automatic transfer, occasionally called for updates, but never visited. Not on holidays, not on his birthday. Never. "Mr. Giovanelli," she said softly, crouching down to his eye level. "I'm listening. What are you trying to tell me?" His gaze intensified, boring into hers with an almost frightening desperation. His right hand, the only one he could still partially control, trembled as it hovered over the shoe. He was trying to point at something, she realized, not just tapping randomly. Abigail studied the footwear more carefully. It was a man's dress shoe, well worn but once of good quality. Hand-stitched leather, the kind craftsman like Leo himself would have made. The sole was slightly detached near the heel, and the leather had cracked with age. "Is this your shoe? From when you were younger?" Leo's eyes shifted slightly, not quite a no but not agreement either. The silence between them stretched, filled only with the soft beep of the vitals monitor and Leo's labored breathing. Abigail felt a peculiar pressure in the room, as if the very air was charged with something unspoken, a message trapped inside a man who could no longer speak. "I'll help you, Mr. Giovanelli," she promised, though she wasn't sure what she was promising. "Whatever this is about, I'll try to understand." Later that night, after helping Leo into bed, Abigail checked his care plan. She wanted to see if there was any note about the shoe, any clue to its significance. The medical record was sparse on personal details, but one thing caught her eye, a notation from his initial intake. Personal effects: 1 suitcase containing clothes, toiletries, wallet with ID and $42. 1 framed photo of deceased wife. 1 pair of worn dress shoes, resident insisted on keeping. So the shoes had been important enough that he'd fought to keep them, even in his diminished state. The next morning, as Abigail helped Leo get ready for the day's activities, she decided to try putting the old shoes on him for his morning walk in the garden, instead of the standard facility-issued slippers. As she lifted his left foot to slide the leather shoe on, something hard shifted inside the sole where it had started to separate from the upper. Abigail paused, holding the shoe. Something was definitely inside it, something that made a small but distinct sound as it moved. Leo's eyes were suddenly on her, wide and alert. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the air between them electric with unspoken significance. "There's something in here, isn't there?" she whispered. Leo's gaze never wavered, his eyes welling with tears again. Whatever secret the old cobbler had hidden in his shoe, Abigail realized in that moment that she was now the keeper of that secret. A secret important enough to make a mute man find a way to speak. The administrative conference room at Pine Grove Care Center had always felt too sterile for Abigail's liking. With its faux mahogany table, industrial-grade carpet and generic watercolor prints of seaside landscapes, it seemed deliberately designed to hide the reality of aging and death behind a veneer of corporate blandness. Today, however, the room felt even more suffocating. Abigail stood in the corner, clipboard in hand, pretending to review medication charts while surreptitiously observing the 2 men seated at the table. Dylan and Charles Giovanelli had arrived 10 minutes ago for their mandated meeting with Lisa Donovan, the facility's social worker. They'd been summoned to discuss their father's deteriorating condition, though Abigail suspected the real reason was that Lisa had grown suspicious about their prolonged absence. "As I mentioned on the phone, gentlemen," Lisa said, sliding a folder across the table, "your father's neurological assessments show some concerning patterns. Dr. Mercer believes he may be experiencing increased cognitive awareness trapped within his physical limitations. It's called locked-in syndrome and—" "Look," interrupted the younger brother Dylan, checking his Rolex with exaggerated impatience. "We're both incredibly busy. Charles has a merger closing next week and I've got clients flying in from Tokyo tomorrow." Dylan was the picture of East Coast affluence, in his tailored navy suit and spotless wingtips. that probably cost more than Abigail made in a month. His manicured hands betrayed no trace of his father's working-class origins, no hint that he was descended from a man who had worked with leather and awls for over 40 years. "We're paying premium rates for his care," added Charles, the older brother, whose thinning hair and perpetual scowl made him look a decade older than his 48 years. "Isn't that enough? What exactly do you expect from us?" Lisa's professional smile tightened. "Your father's emotional well-being is also important. Regular visits from family can significantly impact—" "Our father barely knows who we are anymore," Charles cut in with a dismissive wave. "He's basically a vegetable. The last time we visited, he just stared at the wall." Abigail felt her blood pressure spike, her grip tightening on the clipboard until her knuckles whitened. That vegetable had spent the past 3 nights trying desperately to communicate something through the only means available to him. That vegetable had more dignity and determination in his paralyzed pinky finger than these two had in their entire bodies. "He can't even talk," Dylan added with a chuckle that made Abigail's skin crawl. Hell, by the end, he could barely tie his own shoes. The man who made shoes for half of St. Paul couldn't even tie his own laces. "Ironic, isn't it?" Charles laughed. A cold, hollow sound. "Remember when we found him trying to polish those ancient leather monstrosities he refused to throw away? His hands were shaking so bad he'd gotten polish all over the carpet. What did he say then? 'These shoes walk me to America. They'll walk me to my grave,'" Dylan mimicked in a poor Italian accent that made Abigail's jaw clench. "Sentimental old fool," Charles muttered, shaking his head. "Always with the melodrama about the old country, the immigrant struggle. Meanwhile, we were busting our asses at private schools he could barely afford, trying to fit in with kids whose parents didn't smell like leather and shoe polish." Lisa attempted to steer the conversation back to Leo's care plan, but Abigail had heard enough. She slipped out of the conference room, heart pounding in her throat. Halfway down the corridor, she realized she was heading straight for room 217. The door was ajar, and through the gap she could see Leo in his wheelchair, positioned near the entrance. His eyes were open, fixed on the hallway that led to the conference room. He'd heard everything. Somehow, Abigail knew it with absolute certainty. Leo's thin frame seemed even smaller now, collapsed in on itself like a dying star. But his eyes, those eyes that had been pleading with her for days, now held something new. Beyond the pain, beyond the tears that had started to roll down his sunken cheeks, there was resolution. "Mr. Giovanelli," Abigail whispered, entering the room and closing the door behind her. She knelt before him, taking his cold hand in hers. "I'm so sorry." The old man's fingers twitched in hers, a deliberate movement. His eyes darted toward the nightstand where the worn leather shoe now sat, then back to her face, then back to the shoe. "You're trying to show me something, aren't you?" she asked softly. "Something in the shoe?" A single, deliberate blink. "Yes." Abigail retrieved the shoe, turning it over in her hands. In daylight, she could see how meticulously it had been crafted. The tight, even stitching, the careful shaping of the leather. This wasn't just a cobbler's work. It was an artisan's. The sole was partially detached at the heel, and now she could see that the interior had a strange double layer. The shoe had been constructed with a hidden compartment, skillfully concealed within its structure. Without proper tools, she couldn't open it without potentially damaging whatever was inside. She placed the shoe back on the nightstand and squeezed Leo's hand. "I'll figure it out, I promise, but right now let's get you away from here before they come by." After wheeling Leo to the sunroom at the opposite end of the facility, Abigail returned to her duties, mind racing with possibilities. What could be hidden in that shoe? Money, a key, a message? That evening, as she helped Leo prepare for bed, she noticed something she'd overlooked before. While straightening his pillows, her hand brushed against something hard beneath his thin mattress. Carefully, she reached under and extracted a yellowed envelope, brittle with age. The handwriting on the front was shaky but deliberate, written in faded blue ink. "Se un giorno non posso parlare." If one day I cannot speak. Leo's eyes locked with hers, intense and pleading. Abigail slipped the envelope into her pocket without opening it, a silent promise passing between them. Whatever secrets the old Italian cobbler was keeping, whatever message he'd been trying to communicate through his silent persistence, she was now determined to uncover. As she turned to leave, Leo's fingers brushed against her wrist, the lightest touch, but intentional. When she looked back, his expression had changed. Beyond the desperation, beyond the pain of hearing his son's cruel dismissal, there was something else in those weathered features. Trust. The St. Paul Public Library smelled of aged paper and furniture polish, a comforting scent that reminded Abigail of her college days. She'd taken her first day off in 3 weeks, telling her supervisor she needed personal time. Now she sat at a microfilm reader in the local history section, the machine humming softly as she scrolled through decades-old newspapers. Searching for Leo Giovanelli's past had become her obsession. The envelope she'd found beneath his mattress remained unopened in her purse. Something told her she needed context before reading whatever message lay inside. She wanted to understand who Leo was before his sons abandoned him, before his stroke silenced him, before his life was reduced to a sterile room in a care facility. The librarian, a grey-haired woman named Margaret, approached with a stack of folders. "Found some mentions of Giovanelli's shoe repair in the business archives," she whispered. "It was quite the neighborhood institution from what I can tell." "Thank you," Abigail replied, accepting the materials with grateful hands. She'd told Margaret she was researching immigrant-owned businesses for a community college paper, a small lie that sat uncomfortably in her chest. The first article she found was from 1953, a small feature in the community section about new businesses in the Italian district. A younger Leo stood proudly in front of a narrow storefront, his dark hair slicked back, one arm around a beautiful woman with knowing eyes and a hesitant smile. The caption read, "Leonardo and Maria Giovanelli Open Saint. Paul's newest shoe repair shop on Fairview Avenue." Leo couldn't have been more than 25 in the photo, his posture straight, his smile confident. The war in Europe was over and America was booming. An immigrant's dream crystallized in black and white. As Abigail scrolled through the years, Leo's business appeared repeatedly in local papers, sponsoring Little League teams, offering shoe repair lessons to troubled youth, donating footwear to refugee families. One article from 1972 particularly caught her eye, "The Man Who Made Shoes for Generations." The yellowed photograph showed Leo with his work-worn hands crafting a pair of leather boots, his concentration evident in the slight furrow of his brow. The article described how the mayor himself had commissioned Leo to repair his favorite wingtips, how judges and janitors alike trusted only Giovanelli with their footwear. "His hands speak a language older than words," the reporter had written. "Each stitch tells a story of craftsmanship passed down through centuries of Italian artisans." Abigail's throat tightened. Those same hands now lay useless in room 217, able only to tap weakly against leather in a desperate attempt to communicate. But nowhere in these clippings was there any mention of substantial wealth or fortune. The shop had been successful, certainly, but nothing that would explain millions in hidden assets. Leo had lived modestly in a small house behind his shop. His sons had attended good schools, but not elite ones. The family had taken occasional vacations to the lakes up north, but never abroad. By mid-afternoon, Abigail's eyes burned from squinting at microfilm, and her notes filled several pages of her spiral notebook. She gathered her materials, thanked Margaret, and stepped out into the crisp September air. Instead of heading home, she drove to Fairview Avenue. The old Italian district had gentrified considerably over the decades. Hip coffee shops and boutiques now occupied storefronts where family businesses had once thrived. She walked slowly down the street until she found number 1423, once Giovanelli's shoe repair, now an artisanal cheese shop. "Can I help you?" asked a young man, arranging a display of imported brie. This used to be a shoe repair shop, didn't it?" The man nodded. "Way before my time, but the landlord mentioned it. Apparently the old guy who ran it was here forever, like 40 or 50 years. Retired maybe 15 years ago?" Abigail peered past him to the back of the store, trying to imagine Leo at his workbench, the rhythmic sound of his hammer, the smell of leather and polish filling the air. "Do you know what happened to him after he retired?" The young man shrugged. "No idea. The place was empty when we took over the lease." Thanking him, Abigail continued down the street. At the corner deli, an elderly gentleman sat outside reading a newspaper. On impulse, she approached him. "Excuse me, sir. Did you ever know the shoemaker who had a shop down the block? Leo Giovanelli?" The old man lowered his newspaper, roomy eyes brightening with recognition. "Leo, of course, everyone knew Leo. Fixed my loafers for 30 years. He tapped his foot, showing off a well-maintained pair of brown Oxfords. "Made these special for my retirement in '89. Still good as new. What kind of man was he? Abigail asked softly. Salt of the earth, honest as the day is long, worked harder than anyone I knew. The old man's expression softened with nostalgia. Always had a story about the old country, always had a piece of candy for the neighborhood kids. Loved his Maria something fierce too. Never was the same after she passed. As the sun began to set, Abigail reluctantly ended her investigation and drove to her small apartment. The zapato, Leo's shoe, sat wrapped in a towel on her dining table. She'd brought it home, unable to explain to herself why she'd taken it from the facility. It wasn't theft, she reasoned. She was helping him. Carefully unwrapping it, she studied the craftsmanship more closely. The hidden compartment in the sole was ingenious, invisible unless you knew to look for it. Leo hadn't just been a cobbler, he'd been an artist. Abigail called her neighbor Mike, the building's maintenance supervisor who had a workshop in the basement. Remember when you offered to help me with home repairs anytime? I need a small favor. 20 minutes later, they stood in Mike's workshop, the shoe placed carefully on his workbench. So you need to open this without damaging it? He asked, examining the stitching. Yes, I think there's something hidden in the sole. Mike worked with surprising gentleness for a man with such large hands, using a seam ripper to carefully detach the outer sole from the inner one. When the final stitch gave way, he lifted the layer, revealing a small hollowed-out space, and there, nestled in the cavity, was a brass key. Old-fashioned and slightly tarnished, it had a small plastic tag attached with faded lettering, LJ Storage Unit 14. What's that for? Mike asked. Abigail took the key with trembling fingers. I'm not sure yet, but I intend to find out. That night, as Abigail drove back to Pine Grove, the key felt heavy in her pocket. She'd carefully stitched the shoe back together, wanting to preserve Leo's craftsmanship. When she entered room 217, Leo was awake, his eyes immediately finding hers in the dimness. She approached his bedside and whispered, I found the key, Mr. Giovanelli. She held it up so he could see it. For the first time since she'd known him, Leo's face transformed with an emotion that wasn't pain or desperation. It was relief. His eyes closed briefly, a single tear tracking down his weathered cheek. But when they opened again, something was wrong. His pupils dilated suddenly, and his right arm began to shake violently. The monitor beside his bed shrieked as his heart rate spiked dangerously. Help! Abigail screamed, reaching for the emergency call button. I need help in here. As medical staff rushed in, Abigail was pushed aside. She watched in horror as Leo's body convulsed, his face contorting in pain. The key slipped from her fingers, landing silently on the linoleum floor beneath his bed. 3 days had passed since Leo's seizure. The doctors called it a stress-induced neurological event, but Abigail knew better. It was the culmination of too much emotion, relief at being understood, followed by fear that his secret might die with him. Leo now drifted in and out of semi-consciousness, his thin body even more fragile than before, tethered to this world by IV lines and beeping monitors. Dr. Patel had adjusted his medication, stabilizing his condition, but the prognosis remained guarded. His brain activity is surprisingly strong, the neurologist had told the staff during rounds. It's as if he's fighting to stay present, to remain aware despite his body's deterioration. Abigail had retrieved the key from beneath Leo's bed that night, hiding it in her locker until she could decide what to do. Today was her day off, and she'd spent the morning in her car, the address from the key tag entered into her GPS, Riverside Storage Facility, a 20-minute drive from Pine Grove, in one of St. Paul's oldest industrial districts. The October sky hung heavy and gray above her as she sat in the parking lot, questioning herself. Was this illegal? Unethical? She was about to use a key she'd found hidden in a patient's shoe to access a storage unit that legally belonged to him, but he couldn't tell her to do this in words, only in desperate glances and labored taps against leather. I'm doing this for him, she whispered to her reflection in the rearview mirror, her face pale with anxiety. No one else will. The storage facility looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Rows of rust-streaked metal doors set into concrete walls, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The office was a small prefab structure with cloudy windows and a flickering open sign. Inside, an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses glanced up from his crossword puzzle. Help you? Abigail clutched her purse where the key rested in an inner pocket. I'm here to access Unit 14. I have the key. The man eyed her over his glasses. Unit 14's been paid up for decades. Automatic payments, one of our oldest rentals. I know. I'm helping the owner. He's in long-term care now and asked me to retrieve some documents. It wasn't entirely a lie, which made the knot in her stomach loosen slightly. The man studied her face for a moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Sign in here," he said, pushing a yellowed ledger toward her. "Units 10 through 20 are in the back building. Take the gravel path around to the left." Abigail signed her name with trembling fingers and hurried outside before he could ask more questions. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes as she followed the path past the main storage building to a smaller structure set apart from the others. It looked older, with heavy steel doors instead of roll-up ones. Unit 14's padlock was rusted but still functional. The key slid in with resistance, requiring both hands and considerable force to turn. The lock finally opened with a metallic groan that echoed in the quiet facility. Abigail glanced around nervously, but she was alone among the rows of abandoned belongings and forgotten pasts. The door swung open on protesting hinges, revealing darkness within. She fumbled for her phone, activating its flashlight. The beam cut through decades of undisturbed darkness, illuminating a small space about 10 feet square. Unlike the cluttered chaos she'd expected, the unit was nearly empty, except for a single object in the center, a large wooden chest, the kind immigrants once used to carry their worldly possessions across oceans. The chest was crafted of dark wood bound with brass fittings, now green with age. A heavy padlock secured its lid, but it hung open, as if someone had unlocked it long ago but never lifted the lid to see what lay inside. Abigail approached slowly, dust motes dancing in her phone's light beam. Kneeling before the chest, she drew a deep breath and lifted the heavy lid. It creaked open, revealing contents carefully preserved beneath a layer of tissue paper yellowed with time. Her fingers trembled as she gently moved aside the paper. Inside were dozens of documents, meticulously organized and protected in plastic sleeves. She lifted out the first folder, labeled simply 1970. Inside were stock certificates, dozens of them, for companies whose names she recognized even decades later. IBM, Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, General Electric. Each certificate represented hundreds or thousands of shares purchased when these corporate giants were still growing into their power. The next folder, labeled 1975-1980, contained property deeds for small parcels of land around the Twin Cities area, areas that had once been the outskirts of development but were now prime real estate in thriving suburbs. Another folder held bank statements and treasury bonds dating back to the 1960s, accumulating interest for over half a century. With shaking hands, Abigail began to calculate rough estimates in her head, her background in healthcare administration giving her just enough financial literacy to understand what she was seeing. "Oh my God," she whispered to the empty room. "This has to be worth millions." Beneath the financial documents lay a layer of personal items, faded photographs of Leo and Maria in their youth, letters written in flowing Italian script, small mementos from a life fully lived. And at the very bottom, something unexpected, a vintage tape recorder with a cassette tape inside, labeled simply Maria in Leo's handwriting. Abigail stared at it, feeling as if she'd stumbled upon something sacred, the voice of a woman long gone, preserved for reasons she couldn't begin to guess. With great care, she repacked everything exactly as she'd found it, except for the most crucial financial documents and the tape, which she placed in her purse. She would need to analyze these papers more carefully to understand their full implications. As she locked the unit and walked back toward the office, a prickling sensation crept up her spine, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She turned quickly, scanning the rows of storage units, but saw nothing. Still, her pace quickened as she returned the visitor's ledger and hurried to her car. Only when she was pulling out of the parking lot did she notice a black sedan parked across the street, its engine running. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who sat inside, but as she drove past, the car pulled away from the curb, keeping a careful distance behind her. By the time she reached the highway, the car was gone, leaving Abigail to wonder if her guilty conscience had manufactured the threat. She drove slightly over the speed limit, all the way back to her apartment building, constantly checking her rearview mirror. Inside her apartment, doors locked and curtains drawn, Abigail spread the documents across her kitchen table. The certificates, deeds, and accounts appeared genuine, representing a fortune accumulated slowly, methodically, over decades of careful investment, all in Leo's name. "How did a cobbler amass this kind of wealth?" she murmured, studying a bank statement showing a balance that would have provided comfortable retirement for 3 lifetimes. The tape recorder sat at the center of the table, its presence somehow more significant than all the financial papers surrounding it. Abigail stared at it, knowing that Leo had intended for her to find it, to hear whatever message it contained. With a deep breath, she pressed play. The ancient tape recorder whirred to life, its mechanical innards clicking and grinding like some primitive creature awakening from hibernation. Abigail held her breath, suddenly aware of the weight of this moment. The small kitchen of her apartment seemed to shrink around her, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Static crackled through the small speaker, then silence, and finally, a voice. "Maria," just one word, spoken with such tenderness that Abigail felt like an intruder. The voice was unmistakably Leo's, but not the Leo she knew. This was a younger man, his accent heavier, his tone clear and strong. The recording had the slightly hollow quality of something made decades ago, but the emotion in it remained undimmed by time. "Maria, mia cara," he continued after a long pause. "If you're hearing this, it means I couldn't tell you these things face to face. And I am a coward for that." Another pause, the sound of a deep breath being drawn. "If someone else is listening to this tape, it means something has happened to me, something that has left me unable to speak for myself. And it probably means my sons have failed me, as I failed their mother." Abigail's fingers tightened around her coffee mug, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill spreading through her body. "I need to confess something I've carried for too long." Leo's voice wavered slightly. "In 1968, when the boys were small, when the shop was struggling, when you were working 2 jobs to help us keep our heads above water, I betrayed you, Maria." The tape hissed with silence for several seconds, as if even the recorded Leo needed to gather his courage. Her name was Sophia. She was a customer, wealthy, beautiful, lost. Her husband traveled constantly and she was lonely. I was flattered by her attention. The affair lasted 3 months before you found those receipts in my pocket. Restaurant bills I couldn't possibly afford on our income. Abigail closed her eyes, picturing a younger Maria finding evidence of her husband's infidelity. The shock, the pain, the humiliation. You never asked who she was. You just grew cold, distant. We stayed together for the boys, but something died between us that day. I watched it happen, and I did nothing to save it. Too ashamed to confess, too proud to beg forgiveness, Leo's voice grew thicker with emotion. What you never knew was that Sophia's husband found out too. Robert Sullivan, the investment banker. Instead of the scandal I expected, he came to me with a proposition. He knew I was good with my hands, careful, detail-oriented. He offered me work, special work, crafting hidden compartments in luggage, attaching false bottoms to briefcases. For his confidential business documents, he said. A bitter laugh sounded from the recorder. I knew it wasn't just documents, but the money was too good to refuse, and I told myself it was just leather work, my trade. By the time I realized I was helping launder money for Sullivan's less-than-legal investments, I was in too deep. He had evidence of my involvement. If I went down, I'd drag you and the boys down with me. Abigail's hand flew to her mouth. The cobbler had become an unwitting accomplice to white-collar crime. But Sullivan died suddenly in '72, heart attack on the golf course. His widow, not Sophia, she was long gone by then, wanted nothing to do with his special business arrangements. She paid me a significant sum to keep quiet about certain aspects of her husband's affairs. That money became the foundation of what you'll find in this storage unit. The tape went silent for several seconds, and Abigail thought it had ended. But then Leo's voice returned, softer now. I invested everything carefully over the years, watched it grow. I could have told you about the money after Sullivan died, could have explained everything, but I was afraid you'd ask where it came from, afraid the truth would destroy what little was left between us. A heavy sigh filtered through decades of magnetic tape, so I kept it secret, even after you developed cancer in '89, even when the treatments drained our regular savings. I kept this fortune hidden, used only enough to ensure you had the best care, disguised as loans from the bank. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment to tell you everything, but that moment never came. Abigail wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. The weight of Leo's decades-long secret pressed against her chest, as if it were her own burden. After you died, Maria, I thought about telling the boys, but they had grown into men I didn't recognize, men obsessed with status and appearance, viewing my humble shop with embarrassment. The hard-working immigrant father who put them through college became someone they visited out of obligation, if at all. His voice hardened slightly. I watched them compete for promotions and possessions, watched them grow distant from each other and from me. Money had become their measure of worth, their god. And I knew, giving them this fortune would only feed the worst in them. The tape hissed with silence again, longer this time. So if you're listening to this, and you're not Maria, which you can't be, because my Maria has been gone for 15 years now, then you've found what I've hidden. This money isn't stolen, it's been legally mine for decades, but it was born in shame, preserved in secrecy, nurtured by regret. Leo's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. This wealth is not a reward. It's a responsibility. If my sons have abandoned me, as I fear they might if I ever become unable to care for myself, then this fortune isn't meant for them. It's meant for whoever still sees value in a broken old man who made too many mistakes. A long pause followed, filled only with the sound of breathing. The inheritance shall be for whoever sees my worth, not as a bank account, but as a human being deserving of dignity in my final days. The tape clicked loudly as it reached its end, the silence that followed deafening in Abigail's small kitchen. She sat motionless, tears streaming down her face, the weight of Leo's confession settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering against her windows in a gentle rhythm that seemed to underscore the gravity of what she'd just heard. The financial documents spread across her table were no longer just papers. They were physical manifestations of a lifetime of secrets, regrets, and unspoken words. Abigail wiped her eyes and stood, filled with renewed determination. She would honor Leo's wishes, would protect his dignity and his legacy. She carefully gathered the documents, placing them back in their folders, and tucked the tape recorder into her bag. Tomorrow she would visit Leo, would hold his hand and let him know he'd been heard at last. She would tell him. A sharp knock at her door made her freeze. It was nearly midnight. She wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Miss Winters, we know you're in there. We need to talk about our father." Charles's voice, cold and demanding, sliced through the wooden door. Abigail's heart hammered in her chest as she quickly swept the folders into her bag, hiding them beneath the sofa cushions. "Coming," she called, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. When she opened the door, both Giovanelli brothers stood in her hallway, their expressions hard. Dylan's eyes darted past her, scanning her apartment. "You went to a storage facility today," Charles said without preamble. "Storage Unit 14. We'd like to know why." The fluorescent light in Abigail's hallway flickered overhead, casting shifting shadows across the Giovanelli brothers' faces. Both men loomed in her doorway, their expensive suits and polished shoes incongruous with the worn carpet and peeling paint of her apartment building. The contrast made them seem like predators who had wandered into unfamiliar territory, dangerous and out of place. "How did you find my address?" Abigail asked, her fingers still gripping the edge of the door, ready to slam it shut if necessary. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had they followed her from the storage unit? Bribed someone at Pine Grove for her personal information? Charles smiled thinly, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Your address is on the visitor sign-in sheet at the storage facility." The manager was quite helpful when we mentioned our concern about our elderly father's nurse accessing his private property. Abigail's stomach twisted with dread. Of course, she'd signed her full name and address in that yellowed ledger, never considering it might lead the brothers straight to her door. "May we come in?" Dylan asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a question. Without waiting for her response, he placed his hand firmly on the door and pushed forward. Abigail reluctantly stepped aside, acutely aware of the documents hidden beneath her sofa cushions. The brothers entered her small living room, their presence immediately making the space feel cramped and airless. Charles remained standing while Dylan perched on the arm of her second-hand recliner, his manicured fingers drumming against the worn fabric. "Let's not waste time," Charles said, removing his designer glasses and polishing them methodically with a silk handkerchief. "Our father has been acting erratic lately. Dr. Patel informed us of his seizure the other night, quite concerning. The doctor also mentioned you were present when it happened," Dylan added, his gaze sweeping across her apartment as if cataloguing its modest furnishings. And that you've been spending an unusual amount of time with our father. Abigail crossed her arms over her chest, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. I'm his primary care nurse. It's my job to monitor his condition and comfort. And does that job description include rifling through his personal effects? Charles asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Taking his possessions off-site, accessing private storage facilities without family consent. Heat rose to Abigail's cheeks, partly from shame, partly from anger. Your father has been trying to communicate something important, something he couldn't say with words. And you took it upon yourself to interpret these, what, blinks, grunts? The random movements of a man whose brain is failing? Dylan laughed coldly. Please. He's not random, Abigail snapped, her protective instinct flaring. He's still in there, still aware, still trying to be heard. By you? Charles raised an eyebrow. A minimum wage nurse he's known for all of 5 months? Not by his sons who've known him their entire lives? His sons who visit once every never, Abigail retorted before she could stop herself. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Charles's expression hardened into something dangerous, while Dylan's false affability vanished completely. Careful, Charles said softly. Very careful, Ms. Winters. You're already on thin professional ice. Taking patient property off-site could cost you your license. Abigail's pulse pounded in her ears. Is that a threat? It's a reality check, Dylan interjected, standing now. Whatever you think you've discovered about our father, whatever wild treasure hunt he's sent you on, it ends tonight. Our father's mental state is compromised, Charles continued, stepping closer. Any instructions he may have given you, explicitly or implicitly, are not legally valid. As his legal next of kin and medical proxies, we have full authority over his affairs. Abigail fought to keep her expression neutral despite the panic building inside her. I haven't discovered anything. I was just trying to help him. Then you won't mind handing over whatever you found at Storage Unit 14. Dylan's hand extended, palm up, expectant. The manager confirmed you spent nearly 30 minutes inside. I've already turned everything over to the facility's attorney, Abigail lied, the words tumbling out before she could consider them fully. For safekeeping. Standard protocol when dealing with patient assets. Charles's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Which attorney? I know every lawyer associated with Pine Grove. Abigail's mind scrambled for a name, any name, but came up blank. I don't recall. It was arranged through administration. You're lying, Charles said flatly. Poorly. Dylan moved suddenly, striding toward her small dining table where her bag sat. I'm guessing whatever you found is in here. Don't touch that! Abigail lunged forward, reaching for her bag, just as Dylan grabbed it. In the ensuing struggle, the bag fell to the floor, its contents spilling across the linoleum. Pens, lip balm, wallet, keys, and the edge of a manila folder containing some of the documents from the storage unit. Charles immediately knelt, snatching up the folder before Abigail could reach it. As he flipped it open, his expression transformed from suspicion to shock, then to something darker. Greed mingled with rage. Stock certificates, he murmured, leafing through the pages. Property deeds, bank statements. His head snapped up, eyes boring into Abigail. You were stealing from him. No, Abigail protested. He wanted me to find these. He's been trying to tell me about them for weeks. Dylan had gone unnaturally still, staring at the papers in his brother's hands. How much? He asked, his voice barely audible. Charles continued scanning the documents, his breathing becoming more rapid with each page. Millions, easily millions, maybe tens of millions with compound interest. The tape recorder had rolled under the edge of the sofa, partially hidden by its dust ruffle. Abigail prayed they wouldn't notice it. This money belongs to our family, Dylan said, his earlier smoothness replaced by raw entitlement. Our father clearly hid it from us, probably to avoid proper estate taxes. You have no right to it, Abigail said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Your father made his wishes clear. Clear? Charles laughed bitterly. A mute, paralyzed old man made his wishes clear. That wouldn't stand up in any court, and you know it. There's more, Abigail said desperately. There's a tape. He explains everything. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Both brothers went completely still, their eyes scanning the floor. A tape? Dylan repeated. Where? Abigail remained silent, but her involuntary glance toward the sofa betrayed her. Charles immediately dropped to his knees, reaching beneath the furniture and extracting the old tape recorder. This? He asked, holding it up like evidence at a trial. "Let me play it for you," Abigail pleaded. "Just listen to what your father has to say." Charles examined the device with contempt. Some ancient recording that could have been made by anyone. That won't hold up legally either. With a sudden, violent motion, he pressed the eject button and removed the cassette. Before Abigail could react, he snapped the plastic casing, pulling out the magnetic tape and crushing it in his fist. "No!" Abigail cried, lunging forward. She collided with Dylan, who grabbed her arms, restraining her as Charles methodically destroyed Leo's recorded confession, ripping the ribbon, twisting it into a tangled mess that could never be played again. "That was your father's voice." Abigail's voice broke as tears sprang to her eyes. "His words, his last message to you." Charles dropped the mangled remains onto her floor, grinding a final piece beneath his heel. In the corner of the room, completely unnoticed by all three, Leo's weathered face appeared in the doorway of Abigail's apartment, pale, tearful, and utterly devastated. A nurse from the facility had wheeled him there after Abigail didn't show for her shift. Concerned when she couldn't be reached by phone, the young aide now stood frozen behind Leo's wheelchair, witnessing the scene with wide, horrified eyes. A single tear tracked down Leo's wrinkled cheek as he watched his sons destroy his final confession, his last attempt to set things right. In that moment, the old cobbler's expression contained decades of disappointment, regret, and a profound, bottomless grief that transcended his physical limitations. The silence in room 217 was heavy as moonlight spilled through the partially open blinds, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in Abigail's apartment, 3 days during which the Giovanelli brothers had secured a temporary restraining order, preventing her from coming within 50 feet of their father. The official reason, documented in Pine Grove's records, was suspected elder financial exploitation. The real reason, Abigail knew, was to keep her away from whatever secrets still remained. But tonight, the night shift supervisor had called in sick. Short-staffed as usual, Pine Grove had little choice but to bring Abigail in to cover. The brothers couldn't dictate staffing to the facility, not when state regulations required specific nurse-to-patient ratios. So here she was, back in Leo's room for the first time since that awful night. Leo lay in his bed, thinner than before, his skin almost translucent in the moonlight. The EKG machine beeped softly beside him, its green line rising and falling in reassuring peaks and valleys. His eyes were closed, but Abigail knew he wasn't asleep. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his right hand occasionally twitched, he was aware of her presence. "Mr. Giovanelli," she whispered, closing the door softly behind her. "I'm so sorry." His eyes fluttered open, finding hers immediately in the dimness. There was no accusation in his gaze, only a profound weariness that made her heart ache. "Your sons have taken everything from the storage unit," she continued, checking his vital signs as she spoke, the perfect cover for their conversation. "They destroyed the tape. I couldn't stop them." Leo blinked slowly, once. In their private language, this meant he understood. "But they don't know everything, do they?" Abigail asked, adjusting his blanket. "There's something else, something we missed." His right index finger moved slightly against the sheet, a tiny, deliberate motion. Abigail leaned closer, pretending to check the IV line in his arm. "The other shoe," she breathed. "We only checked one shoe." Leo's eyes widened fractionally, and his finger tapped once against the mattress. "Yes." Moving with deliberate casualness, Abigail walked to the small closet where Leo's few personal belongings were stored. The brothers had taken most items of value, his watch, his wallet, even the framed photo of Maria, but they had overlooked the second worn leather shoe, deemed worthless by men who measured value only in dollars. The left shoe sat on the closet shelf, its leather cracked with age, its sole partially detached like its mate. Abigail took it down, holding it reverently as she returned to Leo's bedside. "Is there something in this one too?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Leo's eyes fixed on the shoe with an intensity that needed no translation. Abigail turned the shoe over in her hands, examining it carefully. The craftsmanship matched the right shoe, same careful stitching, same hidden compartment in the sole, but how to open it without the proper tools? She couldn't take it home this time, couldn't risk being caught with patient property again. Inspiration struck as she recalled the emergency sewing kit in the supply closet. Slipping out of the room, she returned moments later with a small plastic case containing scissors, thread, and a miniature seam ripper. Working quickly but carefully, she began separating the outer sole from the inner one, using the same technique Mike had shown her. The stitches gave way reluctantly, decades-old thread clinging stubbornly to its purpose. Finally, the sole separated enough for her to peer inside. "There's something here," she whispered, excitement making her fingers clumsy. An envelope. Unlike the key in the right shoe, this hiding place contained a sealed legal envelope, yellowed with age but still intact. The return address belonged to Martelli and Sons, attorneys at law, with a date stamp from 5 years earlier, shortly after Maria's death. Abigail carefully extracted the envelope without tearing it, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might wake patients in neighboring rooms. The seal had already been broken. The document inside had been read at least once before being hidden away. She unfolded the heavy paper with trembling fingers, angling it toward the moonlight streaming through the window. The letterhead was formal, embossed with the law firm's logo. "Last Will and Testament of Leonardo James Giovanelli," read the title in bold, formal type. Abigail's eyes scanned the legal jargon, searching for the crucial passages. Most of it was standard boilerplate until she reached page 3. "I, Leonardo James Giovanelli, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions, assets, properties and investments to the person who hears me when I cannot speak." The line was handwritten, added to the typed document and initialed by both Leo and the notary. It stood out starkly against the formal legal language surrounding it. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten addendum, dated 3 years later. "Should I become incapacitated and unable to communicate through conventional means, I designate Abigail Elizabeth Winters as the sole beneficiary of my estate, in recognition of her compassion and humanity in my final days." Abigail gasped softly, her full name, written in Leo's steady hand before she'd ever met him, before his stroke, before Pine Grove. Beside the addendum were 3 signatures, Leo's and those of 2 witnesses, along with an official notary seal. "How?" she whispered, looking at Leo with bewilderment. "How did you know my name before we even met?" Leo's eyes glistened with tears, and his mouth twisted in what might have been an attempt at a smile. He blinked 3 times in succession, their signal for later. This wasn't the time for that particular revelation. Abigail's mind raced. This document changed everything. A legally executed will that specifically named her, properly witnessed and notarized. The brothers couldn't easily dismiss or destroy this as they had the tape. "I need to get this somewhere safe," she said, carefully refolding the document. "Somewhere your sons can't find it." As she spoke, she heard footsteps in the hallway, the distinctive click of expensive shoes on linoleum. Her head snapped toward the door just as the handle began to turn. In one fluid motion, Abigail slipped the will into her uniform pocket and returned the shoe to the closet shelf. When Charles Giovanelli stepped into the room, she was simply adjusting Leo's pillow, her expression professionally neutral. "What are you doing here?" Charles demanded, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "There's a restraining order." "I'm covering the night shift," Abigail replied calmly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Staffing shortages. Your father needed his medication." "I'll be speaking to administration about this in the morning," Charles said, setting his briefcase on the visitor's chair. "For now, I need to discuss some financial matters with my father, privately." "He needs his rest," Abigail protested, standing protectively beside Leo's bed. "He needs to sign these papers," Charles countered, removing a document from his briefcase. "Power of attorney, strictly routine." Abigail glanced at Leo, whose eyes were now wide with alarm. "He can't sign anything, he can't hold a pen." "That's why I've brought this," Charles said, producing a rubber stamp with what appeared to be Leo's signature. "Approved by the court for just such circumstances. Now please leave us." The will in Abigail's pocket felt as heavy as stone, its presence both a burden and a shield. She knew what Charles intended, to gain legal control over Leo's assets before anyone else discovered them. 10 minutes, she said firmly. "Then I need to check his vitals again." As she stepped into the hallway, the document burning against her chest, Abigail made a silent vow to the old cobbler who had trusted her with his last secret. This time, she wouldn't fail him. The sky outside St. Paul's Sacred Heart Cathedral was the particular shade of deep blue that only appears in those few precious minutes between night and dawn. A light dusting of early November snow had fallen overnight, transforming the city into something from a faded postcard. All soft edges and muted sounds. The cathedral's stained glass windows remained dark, the morning mass still hours away. Inside, a single figure sat in the last pew, head bowed not in prayer but in exhaustion. Abigail had been awake for nearly 30 hours straight, running on adrenaline and gas station coffee. The will remained in her pocket, its edges now soft from constant handling. She'd come here seeking sanctuary, both literal and figurative, somewhere the Giovanelli brothers wouldn't think to look, somewhere she could think clearly about her next steps. The cathedral's massive wooden doors creaked open, allowing a shaft of streetlight to momentarily illuminate the vaulted ceiling. Father Michael, the elderly parish priest, shuffled in, his arthritis more pronounced in the cold weather. "The morning is wiser than the evening," he said, settling beside her on the worn wooden pew. "My grandmother used to say that. Ukrainian wisdom." Abigail managed a weak smile. "I'm not sure any amount of mourning will make this situation clearer, Father." "Try me," he offered, folding his weathered hands in his lap. "Before I was a priest, I was a lawyer. Did 20 years in family practice before the collar. You'd be surprised what these old ears have heard." Perhaps it was his gentle tone, or simply the crushing weight of carrying Leo's secret alone, but Abigail found herself telling him everything: the tapping shoe, the hidden key, the storage unit, the destroyed tape, and finally, the will naming her as beneficiary. Father Michael listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "I remember Leo Giovanelli. He mended my shoes for years. Always refused payment when I needed my dress shoes fixed before Easter services. Said it was his contribution to the church." He smiled at the memory, then continued more solemnly. "What you're describing, a deathbed change of inheritance, a nurse suddenly named as beneficiary. In normal circumstances, it would raise red flags for any estate attorney or probate judge." Abigail's heart sank. "But these aren't normal circumstances." "No," Father Michael agreed. "They aren't. And something you said caught my attention. The will's addendum naming you was dated 3 years ago, long before Leo's stroke, before you ever met him." "I still don't understand how that's possible," Abigail admitted. "How could he know my name?" Father Michael's eyes crinkled with gentle amusement. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but so do crafty old Italian cobblers." He reached for his worn leather briefcase, extracting a business card. "Rebecca Goldstein, best estate attorney in the Twin Cities and an old friend. If anyone can help navigate this situation legally, it's her." As Abigail took the card, her phone vibrated in her pocket. A text from Nancy, the night nurse at Pine Grove. "Get back here now. Leo coding. Doesn't look good." The world seemed to tilt beneath Abigail's feet as she read the message. She showed it to Father Michael, who immediately stood. "I'll drive you," he said, all business now. "And I'm calling Rebecca on the way." The drive to Pine Grove passed in a blur of swirling snowflakes and silent prayer. By the time they arrived, the facility's parking lot was dotted with cars that hadn't been there when Abigail left. The morning shift arriving, administrative staff starting their day, and a sleek black Lexus that could only belong to Charles or Dylan. The scene in room 217 was one of controlled chaos. Dr. Patel stood at Leo's bedside, stethoscope pressed to the old man's chest. 2 nurses checked monitors and adjusted IV lines. In the corner, Charles stood stone-faced while Dylan paced by the window, constantly checking his watch. "BP's stabilizing," announced one nurse as Abigail entered. "He's back," Dr. Patel confirmed, straightening up. "But this was a significant cardiac event, the second in 24 hours. His system is shutting down." "How long?" Charles asked, his tone businesslike, as if inquiring about a delivery timeline. "Doctor." Patel removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Hours, maybe less." "What happened?" Abigail asked, moving to Leo's bedside despite Charles's glare. "Apparent heart attack around 5:30 a.m., Dr. Patel replied. "Mr. Giovanelli refused DNR status in his advance directives, so we intervened, but—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood. They had prolonged the inevitable, nothing more. As the medical team filed out, promising to check back in 15 minutes, an uncomfortable silence descended on the room. Father Michael stood in the doorway, observing with quiet dignity. "Who's he?" Dylan demanded, noticing the priest for the first time. "Father Michael Antonelli," the priest introduced himself. I was Leo's pastor for many years. Well, he's not dead yet, Charles snapped. So unless you're here to perform last rites, I'm here as a friend, Father Michael replied calmly, and as a witness. Before Charles could respond, the door opened again, admitting a petite woman in her 60s with short silver hair and the sharp, assessing gaze of a bird of prey. She wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit and carried a leather portfolio embossed with gold initials, RLG. Rebecca Goldstein, she announced briskly, attorney representing the estate of Leonardo Giovanelli. Charles recovered first, stepping forward with practiced smoothness. There must be some mistake. Our family attorney handles all our father's legal matters. Your family attorney handles your matters, Mr. Giovanelli, Rebecca corrected, opening her portfolio. I represent your father's interests exclusively, have for the past 5 years. She produced a document that Abigail recognized immediately, an exact duplicate of the will hidden in her pocket. This is Mr. Giovanelli's last will and testament, properly executed, witnessed and notarized, Rebecca continued. It names Ms. Abigail Winters as his sole beneficiary, with specific instructions regarding the disposition of his assets. Charles's face flushed dark red. This is preposterous. She's manipulated a sick old man. The addendum naming Ms. Winters was added 3 years ago, Rebecca interrupted, her voice steel beneath silk, long before she ever met your father. The witnesses were myself and Father Michael Antonelli. All eyes turned to the priest, who nodded solemnly. Leo came to me after Maria's funeral, said he'd had a dream, a vision of sorts. A young woman with auburn hair would care for him in his final days, would hear him when he couldn't speak. He even knew her name. Convenient, Dylan sneered. A mystical vision. That won't hold up in court. Perhaps not alone, Rebecca agreed. But the will is legally sound. And there's this. She produced a small digital recorder from her portfolio. A duplicate of the tape you destroyed, Mr. Giovanelli. Leo entrusted it to me for safekeeping, along with copies of all documents from Storage Unit 14. The color drained from both brothers' faces as Rebecca placed the recorder on Leo's bedside table. This doesn't change anything, Charles said, though his voice lacked conviction. We're his sons, his blood. So blood isn't always thicker than water, came a weak, raspy voice from the bed. Everyone turned in shock to see Leo's eyes open, his gaze clear for the first time in months. Dr. Patel had warned them about this, the mysterious final rally that sometimes occurred before death, a last surge of clarity and strength before the end. Papa, Dylan whispered, momentarily stripped of his arrogance. Leo's eyes found his younger son's face. Sangue del mio sangue, he murmured. Blood of my blood. But you forgot what that means. His voice was barely audible, forcing everyone to lean closer to hear. Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort. A father gives everything, not just money, time, love. His breathing grew labored between phrases. You took but never gave, never saw me, only what I could give you. Tears filled Dylan's eyes, whether from genuine emotion or the realization that his inheritance was slipping away. Only he knew. Leo's gaze shifted to Abigail, softening. You heard me when no one listened. You saw me when I was invisible. I still don't understand, Abigail said gently, taking his frail hand in hers. How did you know my name before we met? A ghost of a smile touched Leo's lips. Maria told me, in a dream, after she died. His eyes closed briefly. Said I would know when it was time, and I did, the moment you entered. Room 217. The monitors beside his bed began to chirp softly, warning of dropping vital signs. Leo seemed to gather his remaining strength for one final message. The money is yours now. Use it wisely. Remember us. His gaze shifted once more to his sons, standing awkwardly at the foot of his bed. And you remember what matters, before it's too late. With those words, Leonardo Giovanelli exhaled softly and was still, his weathered hand relaxing in Abigail's grasp. The monitor flatlined, its steady tone filling the room with the sound of absence. Father Michael moved forward, making the sign of the cross over Leo's body. Requiescat in pace, he murmured. Outside the window, the first true light of dawn broke over St. Paul, washing room 217 in gold. As the morning light washed over Leo Giovanelli's peaceful face for the last time, we're left to wonder, what is the true measure of wealth in this life? Not the millions hidden in a storage unit, but the richness of being truly seen and heard by another soul. In his final days, when words failed him, Leo found someone who understood that his value wasn't in his bank accounts, but in the dignity of his humanity. What would you do if you discovered someone had been abandoned by those who should have cherished them most? Would you have the courage to stand firm against intimidation and greed, to honor the wishes of someone who could no longer fight for themselves? Abigail's compassion reminds us that sometimes family isn't defined by blood, but by who stays when everyone else walks away. The shoes we wear through life may become worn and weathered, but the footprints we leave behind tell the true story of who we were. If this story touched your heart, remember that there are countless elderly individuals in care facilities today who simply wish to be heard. Their stories matter, their lives have value, and they deserve our time and attention far more than they receive. Please share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, like if you were moved by Leo's journey, and follow our channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters in this brief, precious life we're given.